just a fool in love with you. I fell for you, and I knew the vision of your loveliness. I hoped and I prayed that someday I'll be the vision of your happiness. Oh, oh, earth angel, please be mine, my darling dear. Love you all the time.
Love must be a kind of blind love. I can't see anyone but you.
Shabam, shabam. Shabam, shabam. Shabam, shabam. Shabam, shabam. Shabam, shabam.
Are the stars out tonight?
Shabam, shabam.
I don't know if it's cloudy or bright. I only have eyes for you, dear. The moon may be high, but I can't see a thing in the sky. I only have eyes for you. I don't know if we're in a garden or on a crowded avenue. You are here, and so am I. Maybe millions of people go by, but they all disappear from view. And I only have eyes for you.
I sit in my room looking out at the rain. My tears are like crystals, they cover my window pane. I'm thinking of our lost romance and how it should have been. Oh, if we only could start over again. I know you never forgive me, dear, for running out on you. I was wrong to take a chance with somebody new. I sit in my room looking out at the rain. My tears are like crystals, they cover my window pane. I know you never forgive me, dear, for running out on you. Oh, how I long to do the things we used to do. I'm lonely and I'm blue, yet I'll try to get along without you. Teardrops, teardrops. God only knows the girl who will love me. Oh, if we only could start over.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to Brown at 70, fulfilling the true promise of school integration. My name is Alejandra Vasquez Bauer.
And my name is Stefan Lewis Lallinger. We are so honored to be able to host this event at such a historic venue, the National African American Museum for History and Culture. Let's give them a round of applause.
We want to thank our partners and co-hosts, the National Coalition on School Diversity and the American Institutes for Research, as well as our many sponsors for their generous support. We are here to commemorate 70 years since the momentous decision in Brown versus Board of Education.
70 years. Think about that. First of all, was it this hot 70 years ago? Sorry, a little climate change joke. Okay, well, let's move on. In all seriousness, 70 years. I want everyone in here to think about what 70 years means. 70 years is about 2 generations. And one of the things that we want you to think about is how much progress can be made in the span of 70 years. Think about your own family. How much has it changed in the last 2 generations? At the same time, some dimensions of progress can also feel painfully slow. Many of our battles for justice today feel far too eerily similar of those from 1954. Our work remains unfinished.
So we're here tonight to grapple with that duality. What has been won in 70 years and what has not?
2 generations ago, in my family, my grandfather, Lewis L. Redding, stood not 2 miles from this place right here at the Supreme Court and argued Brown versus Board of Education alongside Thurgood Marshall 70 years ago. I also want to point out that 2 of his 3 daughters, my aunt, the Reverend J.B. Redding, and my mother, Dr. Rupa Redding Lounger, are here today. Mom and Aunt J.B., where are you? Right there. So, 70 years ago, a day 70 years ago, when a black man stood before the Supreme Court, is a day that his grandmother, my grandfather's grandmother, my great-great-grandmother probably could never have imagined. She was born into slavery in Maryland 2 generations prior. That's progress. At the same time, in dozens of states in 1954, my grandfather would have been unable to vote, would have been unable to dine in certain establishments, and would have been unable to secure a hotel room to sleep at night.
In my family, 2 generations ago, my abuelitos Consuelo and Remigio got on a train from Jalisco, Mexico, and came to the Central Coast of California to work in the lemon and avocado fields. They dreamt of a fulfilling life, not just for themselves, but for their children and their grandchildren and all other Mexican children who at the time were learning in segregated classrooms. They coincidentally arrived just after the decision of Mendez versus Westminster, which desegregated 4 California school districts and led to California becoming the first state to officially desegregate. Thank you. Yeah. And it was in that context that my mother and her siblings first enrolled in school. Progress. And yet, 2 generations later, California schools continue to be highly segregated. Those very towns where my grandparents settled are now unaffordable to most immigrant families, especially those that continue to work in the fields. Wood, Consuelo, and Remigio have thought that their dream would remain this far from reach.
That's why Alejandra and I stand before you here today, because of our progress and our unfinished business. Since Brown, our nation's school children collectively are more diverse than ever. A full 55% of America's K-12 students are students of color, people of color. And yet at the same time, our schools are as segregated as they were in the late 1960s.
At the Century Foundation, we have the privilege of running the Bridges Collaborative, a network of school districts and housing organizations that are making sure that our neighborhoods and classrooms reflect the diversity of our country. Our members are on the ground doing the hard work, and many of them are here today, so if you meet them tonight. They are in places like North Carolina, Seattle, and Tucson, doing things like rethinking school zone boundaries, working to remove bias baked into curriculum, and fighting anti-DEI and anti-immigrant rhetoric that instills fear and threatens the safety of our students. Our challenges may look different today, but they're no less real than they were 2 generations ago. That's why nights like tonight are so important, for us to come together, to learn from each other, and to collectively deliver on the promise of equity in education for all.
Tonight, we encourage you to reflect on 2 generations of progress and unrealized potential. We hope you leave this remarkable museum, which is itself a testament to that duality, with a renewed commitment to finishing the work of Brown versus Board and brimming with hope for the future. You know, about 3 months ago, my daughter Zoe, who's 4.5, did her Black History Month project on her great-grandfather, my grandfather, Lewis Redding. Couldn't have been prouder, and my wife deserves a lot of credit for that project. When Zoe went to school the next day to present her project to her class, Zoe explained all of the things that her great-grandfather did. And as Zoe looked out, she looked out to a sea of faces as diverse as our country, as diverse as this crowd, in fact. That's progress. So tonight, we ask you, what shall be true for your grandchildren? What story will we sit here and tell in another 70 years?
And with that, it is our honor to introduce the president of the Century Foundation, Mark Zuckerman.
Thank you, Stefan and Alejandra, and to Hallie Potter for your remarkable leadership in organizing tonight's event. The Century Foundation is so appreciative of the work of the Bridges Collaborative, and I congratulate all its members here tonight. Let's give them a hand. Most of us know that early in his career, Congressman Clyburn was a school teacher for a few years. I'm here to tell you tonight that the congressman has never quit teaching. He just kept making his classroom bigger to include all of us, and we are truly blessed for that. Congressman, you teach us every day to revere our history, to follow our conscience, to take risks, to turn setbacks into comebacks, to stand up and fight for our civil rights, to build powerful alliances to make progress like you have done all your life. And most of all, to treasure one's dearest friends and family, like your 60-year friendship with John Lewis and your remarkable family, a number of them who are here tonight. Let's have them stand and recognize your family tonight. In 2004, you published Uncommon Courage, a book about one of Brown's original cases, Briggs v. Elliott, because you wanted future generations to know that when history came calling, brave men and women, some of whom you knew personally, took courageous, decisive action to change our country for the better. In 2022, you led the fight to pass legislation to expand Brown v. Board National Historic Site in Kansas to include historic sites that played a critical role in the 1954 landmark Supreme Court decision. The goal of this legislation, as you made clear on the floor of the House, was to continue to tell the story of struggle and perseverance for years to come. That is why we are here tonight. Congressman, in your honor, I want to read the two most cherished sentences of Brown v. Board education decision. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate education facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs are, by reason of segregation complained of, deprived of equal protections under the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Congressman, there is no one in Congress or even in the country better suited to kick us off tonight on this historic 70th anniversary of Brown than you. Congressman Jim Clyburn, please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for introducing and presenting me here this evening. Now, my staff has done good work on researching the lead up to Brown v. Board of Education, and it's good work. But somebody apologize to them for me, because I'm not going to use it. I grew up in the little town of Sumter, South Carolina. And if all goes well, come July 21st, I'm going to celebrate the 45th anniversary of my 39th birthday. Now that means, if your math is good, come July 21st, I will turn 84 years old. Now, that means 70 years ago, I was about to turn 14 on May 17, 1954, when this decision was handed down. Like many of you, I can remember exactly where I was when I got the news. I was on the corner of Bartlett and Salem Street, on my way, walking home from segregated Lincoln High School, when someone came to the door and yelled that this decision had come down. And they were yelling that we will no longer have triple sessions. We are going to be, in September, we'll be going to integrated schools. Or so we thought. 2 years later, a second Brown decision came down. And in that decision, the critical words were with all deliberate speed. We are still trying to figure out what that means. Because I took note of the interesting word here, fulfilling the true promise of school integration. Now, after all of the opposition to Brown, and Brown 2, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which at that time ran from Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, all the way over to Florida. It has since been broken up into two districts. It's now the 5th and the 11th. But the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, sitting in Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, wrestled with what to do to integrate the schools. Now, the Supreme Court, in trying to get to a unanimous decision, did a lot of compromising. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, in trying to implement integration, came to the conclusion that they were never going to get the votes that were necessary to do that. In minor wisdom, one of the judges on that court came up with the idea of moving forward using the term desegregation. So if you go through all of the cases, all the way from Brown, all the way through all of the cases at the circuit court level, you will see that the United States of America, to this day, has not made a commitment to integrate schools. We have desegregated many schools, but we've never committed ourselves to integrate the schools. So the battle still goes. In fact, my father had a saying that he was fond of repeating all the time. He would say to me, son, where there is a will, there's a way. And I point that out tonight because we are still trying to develop the will to integrate our schools, the will of building equity and equality in our system. And I don't know when or how we're going to get there. This I know. Brown v. Board of Education, as many of you know, was one of 5 cases. The original case was Briggs v. Elliott. Well, I should really correct that since Mark has already said I'm at heart a teacher. The first case was Pearson v. Elliott. Levi Pearson, a gentleman farmer in Clarendon County, brought the first lawsuit. And when they got into discovery, they found out that Levi Pearson's farm was situated, most of it, in the school district. But the house he lived in was not inside the school district. And therefore, the case got thrown out. And the lawyers had to start over. And they found a gentleman, Harry Briggs, his wife, Eliza Briggs, both of whom I knew very well. My dad, the minister, prayed every morning over breakfast for Reverend J. Ada Lane, who was the minister that organized them and the people of Clarendon County. Harry Briggs worked at a local filling station making $22 a week. Eliza was a child lady at a local motel making $18 a week. They wanted something better for their children. 2 unlettered people. wanted something better for their children. They didn't ask to integrate schools. Many of you may recall, all they asked was, give us a school bus. Our children are walking 7 miles to school every morning, 7 miles back home in the afternoon, and the white kids are driving past them on the road in school buses. They didn't ask for school buses. They wanted one school bus. And they even told the school board, give us the bus, we'll put the gas in it. And they were denied. And the superintendent said to them, you do not pay enough taxes for us to waste money on the school bus. That was the original case. But the case was folded in with Davis from Virginia, Bolton from Washington, D.C., Belton v. Gebhardt from Delaware, and Brown from Kansas. Now, the big challenge at the time for the lawyers was the fact that John W. Davis, who was the lawyer for the segregationists, he had been hired by states from all over the nation to represent them. He was one of the more prolific lawyers of his time. John W. Davis just happened to have been the 1924 Democratic nominee for President of the United States. He was a holdover from the Redeemers who ran the Democratic Party up until the 1960s. John W. Davis defended all of these states by saying they are not arguing the law, because the law was already determined in Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. That was the law. So John W. Davis' position was, this is the law. So they are not arguing the law, they are challenging a way of life. And the lawyers were very sensitive to that. In fact, when the Briggs case was decided, it was about a 3-judge panel, and the Briggs case was 3-2 to maintain the way of life. A dissenting opinion written by J. Waiters Waring, the great-grandson of a Confederate general, a native of Charleston, South Carolina, who had just had somewhat of a transformation. He was a federal judge. He had been the campaign manager for Pitchfork Glenn Tillman. So everybody expected him to maintain the way of life. But while sitting as a federal judge, something happened to a gentleman who had just been discharged from the Army, going home to his home in Fairfield County, South Carolina, discharged down in Georgia, got on a bus to go home, and stopped in the little town of Abbeville. Lexington, South Carolina, the county of Lexington, Leesville, Batesburg, Leesville. And when he stopped there, he wanted to use the restroom and was denied. He was in his uniform, all of his ribbons covering most of his chest. And not only was he denied, but a deputy sheriff jerked him off the bus, beat him with his billy club, and took the billy club and punched his eyes out. Harry Truman heard about that. That's what made Harry Truman write the executive order to integrate the armed services. J. Waiters Waring sat as a judge on the case. and the deputy sheriff was declared by the jury to be innocent. Waiters Waring, sitting on that case, had a transformation, a Saul to Paul transformation. And so when this case came before him, he wrote a dissenting opinion, disagreeing with the way of life. And as a result, Thurgood Marshall and others took that dissenting opinion, and that became the basis of their appeal of these 5 cases that went up to the Supreme Court. In a 9-0 decision, the Brown case was handed down. A tremendous victory. J. Waiters Waring was chased out of town. He had to leave Charleston. He went to New York. Reverend J. Delane, who organized the folks, was chased out of the state. And when John West got elected governor in 1970, he invited me to his staff. And the first 2 jobs he gave me were to plan a homecoming for Reverend J. Delane. Because it was in New York, it was not allowed to come back to South Carolina. There was an open warrant for his arrest, and he could not come back without being arrested. The second job he gave me was to get the pension restored for Septimus Poinsett Clark. Some of you may know that name. Septimus Poinsett Clark was who Martin Luther King Jr. always called the mother of the movement. Now, the media decided it was Rosa Parks. But the reason Martin Luther King Jr. always said it was Septimus Clark, because she is a woman who taught Rosa Parks at Highlander School in Tennessee. And she had been fired from her teaching job in Ellery, South Carolina, because she refused to denounce her membership in the NAACP. And she lost her pension. I was able to get most of her pension restored, but I was never able to have the homecoming for Reverend J. Delane, who organized the first challenge to school segregation, because there was a person still living who had signed the warrant. I don't ever call the name of the person or even the town that the person was living in, because the town is in my district and the family of the man say they vote for me. So, J. Delane never came back to South Carolina. He came back as close as Charlotte, and that's where he's buried. He wanted to be buried in South Carolina soil, but we were not able to do that. Now, I point this out as the background of Brown, and the reason I do that tonight is because if you read these cases, these 5 cases, now, a lot of people have argued, well, why is a case called Brown? Why wasn't it called Briggs? Alphabetically, it should have been Briggs. Chronologically, it should have been Briggs. So why was it called Brown? Simply because it was a decision made by the judges that the one case of the 5 that was not the Southern case, that was not about preserving a way of life, was the Brown case. And that is why the case is Brown. So several weeks ago, many of you may have seen that a group wanted the name changed, and they petitioned the United States Supreme Court to change the name, and they asked me to sign a letter in support of it, which I did not. George Santayana I often quote, once wrote, if we fail to learn the lessons of history, we are bound to repeat them. Now, the reason I did not sign the letter was because I knew why the name was Brown. And I think that if they had taken time to research why, they would never have done the letter. It was part of their tactics. It was part of what made that decision 9-0. It was part of what made Minor Wisdom and the others on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals do what they did to get the schools desegregated. The question now becomes, will we ever develop the will and find the way to integrate it? Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Clyburn. Good evening, everyone. I am Terrace Ross, Managing Director of the AIR Equity Initiative at the American Institutes for Research. Our work focuses on addressing systemic inequalities in the U.S. and across the globe by funding research, evaluation, technical assistance, and partnerships that contribute to a better, more equitable world. As we gather to recognize the enduring significance of Brown v. Board of Education ruling and explore how we can fulfill the true promise of school integration, my call to action is this. Let us follow the evidence, all of the evidence, and by the end of the evening, you will know why I emphasize this point. I also invite you to read our recently published compendium of essays, Integration and Equity 2.0, New and Reinvigorated Approaches to School Integration. In it, authors from diverse professional backgrounds and also youth offer ideas and recommendations to challenge common deficit-based narratives and propel the urgent conversation on educational equity. It is now my pleasure to introduce Shahina Simons, who serves as Chief of the Educational Opportunities Section of the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. There, Ms. Simmons leads DOJ's work to provide equal educational opportunity for students nationwide by enforcing federal statutes that prohibit discrimination and harassment based on race, color, national origin, sex, religion, and disability. Ms. Simons was previously a deputy chief in the Educational Opportunities Section and a senior trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division Special Litigation Section, where she focused on cases involving police misconduct and conditions of confinement in state and local juvenile facilities. Before joining the Justice Department, Ms. Simons worked at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or MALDEF, first litigating immigrants' rights and employment discrimination cases in the Los Angeles office, and then leading MALDEF's Washington, D.C. National Policy Issues Office. She began her legal career at the law firm of Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson as a Fried, Frank MALDEF Fellow. And she received her JD from Yale Law School and her BA in English and Political Science from Yale. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Shahina Simons.
Good evening. It is such an honor to be here with you this evening, representing the Civil Rights Division at DOJ, where I lead the Educational Opportunities Section. I send regards from Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark, and from all of my colleagues in the education section who work every day to uphold the mandate and the values of Brown. 70 years after the Supreme Court held that separate but equal was no longer the law of the land, Brown stands as both a transformative moment in our country and as a promise yet unfulfilled. We are here because there is still so much work yet to be done. The Brown decision marked the beginning of a decades-long fight to realize the promise of true equality, and that fight met with massive resistance. My office at the Department of Justice, as well as partners in the Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU, and other groups outside of government, filed complaints in courts across the country to enforce the Brown decision. The Civil Rights Division is still litigating more than 135 of these cases today. So, all deliberate speed, right? In doing that work, my staff have confronted the lingering effects of state-sponsored segregation, and we've encountered new and sometimes subtle forms of discrimination. In school discipline decisions rooted in stereotypes, in application of grooming codes and dress codes that stigmatize and exclude our young people from the classroom, in biases that keep students of color from accessing advanced learning opportunities on an equal basis, and in classrooms where students are forced to learn in hostile environments where they face harassment just for being who they are. To achieve full and lasting equality, we must go beyond the places that were previously segregated by law to any place where the promise of Brown is not yet realized. The division has and will continue to investigate discrimination in our nation's public schools and seek to end those discriminatory practices root and branch. The committed lawyers of the Civil Rights Division work every day to advance opportunity and ensure equality for all people in our country. In the last year, the Civil Rights Division, along with co-plaintiffs represented by LDF, secured an agreement with the Fayette County School District in Tennessee to make sure that Black students are properly identified and properly served in the district's gifted and talented programs. Under the agreement, the district will also revise its school discipline policies to support a positive climate, including by ending the use of corporal punishment. In the state of Louisiana, we went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for the second time in recent years after a charter school housed in a former white segregation academy violated the terms of a court order and threatened progress toward desegregation in the school district where it sits, the Concordia Parish School District. And we once again secured victory in that court in the Fifth Circuit. Across the country, both inside and outside of our desegregation docket, we are fighting to make sure that schools are welcoming and safe places for the children who are entrusted to them. We're working in places like Davis County, Utah, where we documented hundreds of uses of the N-word, derogatory racial comments, and physical assaults targeting students at dozens of schools across the school district. And in Madison, Kentucky, where Black students endured egregious harassment, including taunts using Confederate imagery. And in Hawkins County, Tennessee, where we found that incidents of harassment, including a mock slave auction to sell Black students to their white counterparts, students repeated an open use of the N-word, and a campaign to ridicule Black students collectively created a racially hostile environment. Our work to dismantle these vestiges of a time when students were treated as less than human, and that we still see in schools across the country are just a few examples of the way that we are striving to meet our mission every day, a mission that is interwoven with the legacy of Brown. These are difficult stories to hear and to confront. We acknowledge that this work would not be possible without the courageous students, parents, and communities who contact us, who share their stories with us, and who file complaints to stop discrimination in their schools. Their action and their fortitude vividly illustrate the words of the justices in Brown, who described public education as the very foundation of good citizenship. For decades, the Civil Rights Division has worked to implement Brown's mandates for students in public schools across the country. But the passage of time is not the true measure of equality. We remain steadfast in our commitment to using all available tools to make Brown's promise real, so that we may ensure a future of educational fairness, equality, and justice for all, one in which education at long last is provided to all on equal terms. Thank you so much, and I look forward to learning alongside you tonight at the rest of this evening's program.
Good evening. It is so wonderful to see you all in person. Whether you know it or not, tonight you are surrounded by greatness. Take a moment to really take that in. This auditorium is filled with so many people who have provided critical support to me through the years. To name a few: Susan Eaton, John Britton, Sunil Mansukani, Kara McClellan, Janelle George, Kimberly Hall, Dante Turquino, and yes, even Phil Tegler. I want to express my gratitude to you. If you find yourself surrounded by some of your people as well, tonight's a great time to let that be known. And if you're new to us, I hope that you emerge from this evening with caring connections that sustain, inspire, and push you. It is not uncommon to feel alone in this work, but the people in this room can mitigate that. Call on them when you need them. Please meet as many people as you can tonight and carry those relationships forward. And make sure to say hello to me if you have a moment. My name is Gina Turquino, and I serve as the National Coalition on School Diversity's director. NCSD is a cross-sector network of civil rights organizations, university-based research centers, and state and local coalitions working to expand support for school integration. NCSD serves as the main hub of the school integration movement, and we happen to be celebrating our 15th year this year. The concept for tonight's events emerged from several late nights of reading a series of essays edited by Derek Bell, yes, that Derek Bell, and published around the 25th anniversary of Brown. He lamented that the absence of, quote, positive criticism has taken its toll in several areas of civil rights activity, but nowhere has the damage been more apparent than in school desegregation. His authors grapple with some of the thorniest aspects of desegregation implementation. Tonight, we turn the mirror on our movement and attempt to discuss some of the most long-standing and pernicious challenges in our work, with the goal of finding a path forward together. We will barely scratch the surface of these issues, but we aim to open a true dialogue about them in the spirit of Derek Bell's call for positive criticism. No one gets into this work and stays in this work because it's easy or provides instant gratification. We are here out of a deep commitment to changing the circumstances of our nation, of upending white supremacy, and ensuring that all children have access to the resources and opportunities they deserve. We could spend the entire night reading names of people who committed their lives to this work and whose efforts profoundly altered the course of history and helped our nation live more into its values. people who spent time at kitchen tables and in courtrooms or classrooms, doing what they could to bend the arc of justice. It is difficult for many of us to truly fathom the realities they were navigating. I would be remiss not to call into the room a few such people. Nathan Margold, Charles Hamilton Houston, Polly Murray, Thurgood Marshall, Barbara Johns, Julius Rosenwald, Horace Tate, Daisy Bates. We honor them by assuming responsibility for carrying this sacred work forward, and we commit ourselves to taking the time to study the foundation they laid, even when we ultimately choose to take a different path than they did. Tonight, you'll hear from some of the leading voices in our movement. Some will be more familiar to you than others, but all our guests are making important contributions to this work, as are you. We will be joined shortly by Andrew Lefkowitz and Val Brown, co-hosts of the Integrated Schools podcast. Integrated Schools has been an NCSD member and trusted collaborator for many years, and we're excited to bring their signature podcast to you this evening. A few words about the format. We will begin each conversation with some framing statements to set the context for dialogue. I will read the first one, and then the next two will be read by two members of the NCSD, the Chef Movement Coalition and the Dudley Flood Center for Educational Equity and Opportunity. We gather tonight to manifest powerful ideas and prepare ourselves for the next leg of the journey. Thank you for being part of that. Please welcome Andrew Lefkowitz and Dr. Val Brown.
Thank you, Gina. I'm Andrew, a white dad from Denver.
And I'm Val, a black mom from North Carolina. Thank you, thank you.
Yes, we are honored to host these panels on the 70th anniversary Brown v. Board, fulfilling the true promise of school integration.
That's right, and this is not our first time co-hosting. We're honored to co-host the Integrated Schools podcast. And we're very excited to be here with you all tonight. So thank you for giving us your time and attention. We share our identities because we think it's important for our audience to know our positionalities and know that we're going to come at this in a very nuanced way.
That's right. Yeah, on the podcast, we strive to have nuanced conversations about race, parenting, and the persistent segregation of our schools.
Now, normally we have 1 to 2 guests, and we can have a leisure conversation to learn who they are and why this work matters. Tonight, we have several guests. So please grant us some grace as we dive right in.
Yes, these 3 conversations we're going to share could each be an entire episode or several episodes of the podcast, but we're going to jump right in. There's a QR code you probably have seen somewhere that has the bios of all the speakers. We are not going to spend any time giving you their bios. Trust us, they are brilliant people who are worth believing and listening to. We mean them no disrespect by not telling you all of their qualifications, but we want to get right into the conversation. And we have also all agreed to use each other's first names to try to keep it more conversational. Also, no disrespect intended there.
That's right. We're also recording this event, so when the time comes, please share loudly for our panelists, as you might be able to hear yourself on an episode. And yes, and Andrew and I have been dreaming about a live show for a long time, and I know his mom is out here in the audience, so we'd like to say, we'd like to say, Mama, we made it. Yes.
Here we are. We also want to hear from you. On your programs in the back, there should be a QR code to leave us a voice memo. As we said, these are going to be quick. We're going to dive in. There's going to be thoughts that you're left with. Send them to us. You hit a little button, you record a little message, and send it to us. We'll try to use as many of those as we can on the podcast episode we make from this. As you're walking around the galleries later, send us your reflections as well. It's such a powerful place to be. Walk around and send us your thoughts about what you're seeing, what you're experiencing here. We'd love to use your voices. So with that, Gina, I think we're ready to set the context for this first panel.
Okay, and I'm going to put this down lower because I'm short and I've been on my tippy toes. In Brown, the Supreme Court ruled that, quote, separately is inherently unequal. That even if facilities, physical facilities, and other tangible factors are made equal, the very fact of segregation is a violation of the 14th Amendment. To reach this conclusion, the court relied on specific aspects of the social science research submitted by the plaintiffs. Focusing on the research showing harm to Black students, the court found that, quote, to separate Black students from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone, end quote. However, the court was also presented with social science evidence on the negative effects of segregation on white children. In an appendix to the appellant's brief, social scientists wrote that white children suffered, quote, confusion, conflict, and moral cynicism as a consequence of being taught the moral, religious, and democratic principles of the brotherhood of man and the importance of justice and fair play by the same persons and institutions who, in their support of racial segregation and related practices, seem to be acting in a prejudiced and discriminatory manner, end quote. To what extent did the court's focus on the detrimental effects of segregation on Black children create an impression of Black educational spaces as intrinsically inferior, which, particularly in light of massive resistance to desegregation, led to the elimination of those spaces as the main remedy? As scholars like Vanessa Siddle-Walker and Leslie Fenwick have pointed out, many Black educational spaces were, in fact, thriving with strong pedagogy, exceptionally well-educated and credentialed teachers, and a supportive network of care. Many of those teachers and educational spaces were a casualty of the way we went about desegregation. To be clear, it was not Brown, but massive resistance to the implementation of Brown and the continued need to work within the legal constraints that led to many of these outcomes. Tonight, however, we hope to squarely reflect on those issues, acknowledging that hindsight is 20/20. How might we fulfill the true promise of school integration by rethinking the court's framing, taking serious the research showing harm to all kids from segregation, and moving towards a strength-based approach to integration and educational equity?
Thank you, Gina. So it's time to practice. We're going to bring our first two panelists out. Let's make a lot of noise for Damon Hewitt and Stefan Lollinger. All right, here we go. So, Stefan, you mentioned earlier that your grandfather, Lewis Redding, was one of the lawyers who argued the Brown case. You now, 70 years later, teach a class to grad students at American University, and you have them read the decision. It's relatively short, it's not very dense legalese, it's pretty accessible. Tell us about your understanding of the decision, and then your students' reaction to it, and sort of how that broadly reflects our cultural understanding of the decision.
Sure. So we know, at the time the decision was rendered, that it was obviously highly controversial, right? In some parts, there was jubilation. People saw the decision as the nation finally living out its highest ideals. As the congressman mentioned, people thought they were attending integrated schools in the fall. And in other parts of the country, particularly in parts of the South, there was vicious opposition to the decision. Now, what's interesting is we think about how it's evolved in the public consciousness. You might say that Brown's reputation is aged like fine wine, right? Folks generally are not opposed to Brown. In fact, folks support it. If we got 10 politicians on the stage and asked them what was the best Supreme Court decision ever rendered, and many of them, probably 9 out of 10, would say Brown versus Board of Education. But that stands in stark contrast to the segregated nature of our schools. And so there's questions about what does that commitment actually mean? What does that favorability of Brown actually mean? In any case, it's a unanimous decision. Many people think of it as unimpeachable. And so you'd expect when I assign the case to my students that they would all have really favorable opinions of Brown. And by the way, a lot of people think that they've read the decision and they actually haven't. So I encourage folks to actually go read it. It's not very long. And in the class after I assigned the decision, there are overwhelmingly very negative reactions to the text, not the verdict, right? Not the symbolism, the idea that segregation is illegal, but the words that are actually in the text. And the core, the piece that I think rankles students the most is this assumption. They feel there's an assumption baked into the decision, that there is something about Black students and all Black spaces that on its own is inferior, that can't be redeemed without the presence of white people. And that is something for my graduate students that is unacceptable, and they can't live with that. And there's one paragraph in particular that rankles students. I'll read it really quickly and then I'll stop, because I think it's important to read directly from the text, which is, segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. That paragraph always comes up in the class after I assign Brown.
I'm one of the people who had not read it closely until recently, and so in hearing that, I am upset. I understand a little bit more about where we are, and so Damon, this question is for you. You have been deeply involved in civil rights work and as an attorney for a while. I want you to talk to us a little bit about how that language continues to reverberate through the legal system, and how that deficit language continues to harm Black communities.
Sure, well, thanks for having me. What we've seen over decades is that sense of inferiority, that assumption rather of inferiority, actually perpetuating throughout the jurisprudence, throughout this lived experience of Black students and parents, and throughout the thinking, sadly, consciously or subconsciously, of many school leaders. Practically what we've seen is I've litigated a number of school desegregation cases, as many of you in the audience have as well. We see the majority of Black schools being shut down. We see their facilities being called into question, never really enforcing plessy, not really making separate, frankly, equal, right? And I can't tell you how many times Black parents would say, Attorney Hewitt, we just want what those other kids have, what the white kids have, right? And so I think the sense of inferiority actually has also allowed this really twisted logic of narrative. A Supreme Court justice wrote this, I'm going to paraphrase, it's not exact. It never ceases to amaze me how courts can assume that something that is predominantly Black must somehow be inferior. That sounds like a Black nationalist statement, but that was Clarence Thomas.
I heard a gasp. I
am no Clarence Thomas apologist. He twisted the logic of Brown, right? He twisted that logic and said efforts to further do the work that Congressman Kleinberg said wasn't done, the integration of schools, that somehow claimed that Black students were inferior. And so being stuck in that paradigm of inferiority without really understanding Newton's third law of motion, for every force there's an equal and opposite force. You cannot have underprivilege without overprivilege, right? You have to balance that equation, right? And so I think that's what the courts have failed to do.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Gina mentioned Derek Bell. In Silent Covenants, he reconceives of a different version of the Brown decision. And he writes as this sort of imaginary court, I think pushing back on some of that language you mentioned, Stefan. He says, quote, "We suggest that segregation perpetuates the sense of white children that their privileged status as whites is deserved rather than bestowed by law and tradition. We hold that racial segregation afflicts white children with a lifelong mental and emotional handicap that is as destructive to whites as the required strictures of segregation are to Negroes." Damon, I know you have also publicly wondered about a different version of Brown, one that added a white plaintiff. And setting aside the legal challenges of pulling something like that off, what might have been different in both the potential remedies that would come from a case like that, but also in kind of the broader cultural understanding of the case?
Putting me on full blast, Andrew.
That's right.
So,
hey man, you said it.
I've never taught in law school, seriously, I was an adjunct, but you got to think big, right? Outside the box, right? As our litigators do, right? So, I thought about, really difficult to do at the time, right? But I thought about when the NAACP decided to bring the head-on attack on segregated, on de jure education, on America's caste system, what if there were not just one, but a class of white plaintiffs? Not sure who those people would be, but what if there were? Because you think about the theories of equal protection, there is the fact of racial classification being a violation. Then there's the anti-subordination or anti-subjugation line of thinking, which I think was kind of part of the heart of Brown, but it went too far. It should have stopped before those those sentences about inferiority, right? But I wonder if there was a notion that there was a harm that was far-reaching, far and wide, and therefore the remedy would also have to be far and wide and involve everyone who was involved. Even if it was a black-white binary, involve everyone who was involved, then we would not maybe have seen the same types of mechanics and remedies that we saw that was so restrictive and that was so destructive to Black communities.
Y'all can clap. I hear that.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll take it. Stefan, you've written about the power of your black church, the impact, all of that. The impact of your wife being a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and the value of HBCUs. I was in town early enough today to visit the historic Dunbar High School as well and see the beauty in that community there. So can you help us understand the difference between intentionally created culturally affirming spaces and what we often see in segregated schools today?
Absolutely, and I think we live in a day and age where nuanced conversation doesn't happen too often, doesn't happen enough, right? And I would make 3 points on this. I think the first point that I would make is uplifting spaces of affinity have always been important to racial, ethnic, religious, cultural minorities in this country. They've been critical. They've been life-saving for some folk, right? And so for the second-generation Chinese-American student who goes to Mandarin language school on Saturday, or the Muslim-American student who goes to mosque on Friday, or the young black child who goes to church on Sunday, when they show up at the schoolhouse door on Monday, they're better off. They're not worse off. They come with a sense of self. They're strong. They're ready to engage with people who are different than they are. And that's an important point. And we see attacks on that concept today, people labeling that as segregation, and that's not segregation. What segregation is, and this is my second point, and this is thanks to the research of folks like Sean Reardon and Owens, who I believe are in the audience today. The research shows us why racial segregation in K-12 education is so pernicious is because what it does is it tends to concentrate mostly black and Latino students in high poverty schools. And we know what we do to high poverty schools in this country. We give them less resources. We send less experienced teachers their way. We give them less opportunities to access advanced courses. And so that is the operating mechanism by which segregation operates in underfunded, under-resourced K-12 schools. That is segregation, okay? And then the third point that I'll make is a point around agency, all right? So my family chose to go to the church that we went to growing up because we saw something there that we wanted to go to. My wife chose to become an AKA. Well, they chose her too. Right? But the young black child in Detroit who attends a school where 99% of his classmates come from poverty, where 95% of his classmates don't read proficiently, where all the teachers he's ever had are in their first or in their second year, he didn't choose to go to that school. We chose that school for him, and we chose to under-resource and underfund the school. And I think that is the difference, and we don't have enough nuanced conversation around this versus that. They're completely different.
Absolutely. Yeah, give it up for that. So those are sort of the issues. I want us to just, for the couple of minutes we have left here, imagine a new way forward, one that's not based in this deficit mindset, one that acknowledges the ways that both all of our kids, but also our democracy is harmed by segregation and moves away from this deficit mindset. What might that look like?
Well, I think what it looks like is what a lot of us are fighting for. It looks like a school district and a school where you don't have bubbles within bubbles, where you don't have this side of the county, that side of the county, or special programs within the school that others can't access. Now, I know that's controversial because it cuts against a lot of the mechanisms that we know that we've used, that we've leveraged, right? Even in our magnet schools or magnet programs within schools, right? But I believe in the notion that there are no throwaway kids.
Yes, sir.
Right? I believe in the notion that not every child is going to achieve to the same degree, but every child has potential until we tell them they don't, until we retard that potential. I believe that all the things that we fight for are not wishes and hopes for the future, but it's the future that we deserve. And so we have to act like we know. You know, I think every child should have an IEP, whether you have special needs, gifted and talented or not, because we should be uniquely invested in that child's success. Now, of course, that costs money. Of course, that's expensive. Of course, my mother, who taught for 42 years in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, had to go on strike at least once, should have been paid more, right? But that's where we should be placing our value in every single child.
Yeah.
Damon, are you a preacher on the side? You just said a word. I'm going to let Damon have the last word on that one. I think that was a good way to end.
All right. Yeah, nothing else on that? Okay. Well, good. Then we're gonna move right on through. All right. Well, we're gonna welcome to the stage now Elizabeth Horton Sheff, who is the mother and the lead plaintiff in Sheff v. O'Neill and the co-chair of the Sheff movement. And as she comes up, please give another big round of applause to Stefan and Damon. Thank you.
Can I just say hello? Hello. Around the birth of the civil rights movement, integration efforts primarily aimed to desegregate Black and white communities. Given the legacy of slavery, the undoing of rights for Black Americans secured during Reconstruction, and the insidious effects of Jim Crow laws and segregation in the South, this was the just and appropriate focus for the framing of the implementation of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1952. But the fight for civil rights and integration has long been more than just a Black and white issue. Challenges to segregation have been brought by many groups over the course of our nation's history, from cases like Gong Lum versus Wright, in which a Chinese family led one of the first challenges to school segregation in the 1920s, to Mendez versus Westminster in 1947, which ruled that segregation of Mexican American students was unconstitutional and paved the way for many of the arguments in Brown v. Board. Today, Latina students are fast approaching 30% of the total student population, and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders constitute the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in America. Both groups have faced significant discrimination, and many have funneled into extremely segregated schools. As we commemorate 70 years since the Brown decision, and as the neighborhoods and schools and communities continue to change and further diversify, integration efforts must evolve to meet the changing needs of local communities being served. How have integration efforts shifted as our populations have changed since 1954? And how can we fulfill the true promise of Brown for the increasingly multiracial, multi-ethnic America of the next 70 years?
Thank you, Mrs. Sheff. All right, please welcome Vanessa Leung and Anna Cole to the stage to continue the conversation. Come on out.
Whew, all right. Jumping right in again here. Anna, you are the leader of a district in Colorado that is about 60% Latine. All of your schools are pretty close to the district average in terms of their demographics, so segregation between schools isn't a major issue. But as we so often see, segregation can also show up within schools. As you think about integration, particularly with your large Spanish-speaking population, what challenges do you have, and how are you trying to address them?
Thanks, Andrew. You know, in our rural district, there's two things to that question, actually, I want to address. One is how segregation shows up in what looks like integrated schools. and the other are the challenges we face. And I would say our greatest challenge across our rural schools is, or are the limits of a school system that centers whiteness, where the priorities, the interests, the linguistic skills of upper middle income white families drives school culture and decisions and choices. And for example, what that looks like is our Spanish-speaking families are not a challenge, but the limits of our English monolingualism absolutely are. And that reframing is really important because it leads us to different solutions. So when we reframe and think about the limits of whiteness, we come to solutions like language justice that challenge us as a school district to, one, commit to creating spaces where everyone can speak from the language of their heart, two, where we acknowledge that all of us need interpretation, and then three, that we really implement technical solutions where everyone walking in a room picks up a headset if they're not multilingual or bilingual, especially monolingual English speakers. And then the other piece of that question was, demographically, our schools look integrated, but within the school, and Damon mentioned this, kind of bubbles within bubbles. And we have an equity advisory council that especially our Latina students are well represented as leaders on that council. We were looking at our student belonging data, which is really important data. How do kids perceive sense of belonging in schools? And our data, when we disaggregate it for racial groups, is great. Like, it's really high across the state of Colorado, and there's not huge differences between our Latina community and our Anglo community. So I was looking at that data with some of our student leaders, and they said, well, of course we belong, we're half the school. We have our crew, we have our people, and they pushed, and they said, you're asking the wrong question, and what you should be asking is, are we included everywhere, and are we represented everywhere? Because they said, we're not there in AP classes, we're not there on student council, we're not designing the pep rally and planning prom. It's not our stories that are on the intercom every day. And they really push us to say, it's more than just integration, it's about representation, it's about inclusion, and it's even more so, it's about power and it's about agency and who gets to tell the stories.
Yeah.
I love that.
That's great.
Thank you. Vanessa, I'm going to pass this question to you. So the Coalition of Asian American Children and Families recently surveyed Asian American parents in New York City about their views on integration. Why did you decide to do that, and what did you learn?
I'm from a city with the most segregated public school system. And we saw the arguments against integration set up as a really simple us versus them. It was whites and Asians on one side and Black and Latino students on the other. And we really wanted to push back on that narrative. It was really important for us to push back on being used as a wedge to actually think about how we integrate our New York City public schools. We were like, we are saying no to being pitted against each other, and actually wanted to uplift and rather focus on what all of our young people, all of our parents wanted, and that was high quality, supportive, inclusive, and inspiring school environments. And I think that was what we learned was, we wanted to really uplift those stories that were not being covered in the media. We felt like we were often used as a community to sometimes, on both sides of the argument, whenever what was convenient for those who were in power. And so we wanted to really focus, and what we heard from those parents and from our young people, it really was like they did not want a system that allowed selected groups to be able to hoard opportunity. They did not want a system where students had to compete in order to be able to access a well-resourced school, a high-quality school. And what they really believed was there was intrinsically value to being into an integrated learning space, because that was where those environments would create much more rich conversations, being able to be challenged around perspectives, really kind of focus on critical thinking, and that's what would prepare our young people to actually be able to live in the global society that we are in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think it sounds like one of the challenges, one of the ways that the AAPI community in this instance gets used as a wedge is this sort of umbrella thinking that there is an AAPI community that is one community that has one set of beliefs that believes one thing. Obviously, the AAPI community, no community is a monolith. Help us unpack a little bit about not just sort of the diversity of opinion, but also the diversity of lived experiences captured within that big umbrella of Asian American or AAPI.
Yeah. And I am from a coalition, so this is our work about uniting a really diverse AAPI community in New York. I mean, we're talking about a community that is at least 50 different ethnic groups. We speak over 100 different languages. We have varied experience of what brought us here, when, like third, fourth generation to recent immigrants. We have undocumented green card holders, refugees. You know, there's different class and educational differences that, you know, we have low income, working poor, families who are working multiple jobs, and then we have folks who are, you know, who have that college degree, and then all of that gets lumped all together. That diversity and the challenges and the inequities within the AAPI diaspora is lost when we're seen as a monolith. I mean, I think that's been the real challenge for how we address like, we don't see the challenges. It's when data is lumped together under this one umbrella, you know, or sometimes like that data doesn't even exist for us. We're subjugated to other or unknown or not even included in the dialogue. It's like when that happens, we're not building that understanding of the, you know, of the gaps and the challenges. And if we don't articulate those gaps and the problems, then we're actually never gonna get to the right solutions. And so when we actually also don't see where we have those shared struggles and how we can best collaborate on what we need to do to transform our communities together.
Thank you. You can give it up. I heard it.
Sure.
Anna, sometimes we get a little personal on the podcast, so I'm going to ask you like a direct question, an identity-related question. So as a white school leader serving a majority Latino, Latina community, what are some lessons that you've learned in trying to fulfill this promise of integration at a school level?
Thanks, Val.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's similar to what I mentioned before, that is having a really keen awareness and continuing to strengthen an awareness of the limits of a white dominant school system, and to really recognize how centering whiteness doesn't get us to the right practices or solutions that we need to really to support our multilingual and multiracial community. Our Latinx students are similarly as diverse as what Vanessa named. Our students and families represent countries from across and have roots in countries across South and Central America and the Caribbean, linguistically, politically, socioeconomically diverse. And what a white dominant system does is likes to overgeneralize and other and clump groups together. And we lose the diversity of voices, of lived experiences, of possible solutions. And so, you know, I've learned that it's to be very concerned when I hear statements like, well, Latina families think X or want Y, and we really need to be challenged to dig deeper, to build relationships, to really recognize and amplify the many voices that make up our community and center those voices, not the narratives that we're hearing or that a white system likes to generalize.
Thank you. We have another meaty question, but I got the sign that we are at time. So you all have to agree to come on to the podcast so we can continue to ask you meaty questions. Please, let's give it up for Anna and Vanessa. Thank you. All right, we get to welcome Malaysia McClendon, Program Coordinator at the Dudley Flood Center for Educational Equity and Opportunity in North Carolina, whoop whoop, to help contextualize our final panel. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. As we discussed in our first conversation, Brown did not challenge resource inequities between Black and white schools. Instead, the lawyers focused on the impact of state-sanctioned segregation itself. The court recognized that, quote, the Black and white schools involved have been equalized, or are being equalized, with respect to buildings, curricula, qualifications, and salaries of teachers, and other tangible factors. Our decision, therefore, cannot turn on merely a comparison of these tangible factors in the Negro and white schools involved in each of these cases. We must look instead to the effect of segregation itself on public education. However, we know that resource inequities between Black and white schools were and continue to be prevalent and persist despite the goals espoused in Brown. Because Brown sought to end the very concept of segregated schools as a matter of law, it could not, at the same time, effectively address the resource inequities that then continued to exist when its central promise was undermined in the following decades. 14 years after Brown, in the 1968 Green v. New Kent County decision, the Supreme Court finally endorsed a more holistic legal framework for desegregation. In Green, the court held that, in order to remedy segregation, root and branch, districts must address 4 things in addition to student assignment: faculty staff assignment, transportation, extracurricular activities, and facilities. Although Green introduced more factors into the framework for desegregation, resource equity continued to operate on a separate legal track. Not too long after Green, with decisions like San Antonio v. Rodriguez in 1973 and Milliken v. Bradley in 1974, the court turned its back on addressing both segregation and inequitable school funding. Our last conversation focuses on 2 main questions. What are the implications of this bifurcation between integration and resource equity, and how can we address these 2 issues in tandem as we move forward?
Thank you, Malaysia. To help us unpack all of that, please welcome Saba Biretta and Matt Gonzalez. All right, Saba, starting with you, in the courts and I think also in the public's mind, school finance equity and school desegregation are 2 separate things. And I know this is in part why you started your organization, Brown's Promise. What's the harm of keeping those 2 things separate, and what could be gained if we tried to bring those 2 things together as you're trying to do with Brown's Promise?
Sure, thank you. It's such an important observation and very much the reason why Ari Americano and I started Brown's Promise. If you'll indulge me a little bit, I think it's important to really think about how we got to this place where school funding equity and desegregation became so distinct in jurisprudence and policy advocacy and our research. And I teach education law. When I teach Brown, I have to remind my students, Brown is not an education adequacy case. It is a case in which the court demands that states dismantle their systems of de jure segregation. It does not demand that states provide a super high quality education. And if states decide to provide an extremely poor quality education, which unfortunately some of our states have decided to do, but does that with no legally imposed segregation of the races, there's no violation of Brown. So right there in our seminal case regarding school desegregation, the court is treating segregation as an issue separate and apart from the laws and the policies that create resource inequities between schools. So then we know that framework is confirmed by Rodriguez, where the court says there's no federal constitutional right to an education and refuses to find a constitutional violation where Texas is clearly providing a different quality of education to students in low wealth districts than in high wealth districts. And the court sort of passingly acknowledges, yeah, those low wealth districts also happen to be populated solely by Mexican and Black students, but it wasn't a case alleging legally imposed segregation, so there's no real discussion of the laws and the policies that allowed for the proliferation of low wealth segregated school districts in Texas. So given the law's treatment of these issues is so distinct, it makes sense that the public also sees them as distinct. And I think the harms that have resulted from this, in my view, are one, states have maintained these racially neutral laws around student assignment, around how we draw our district lines, around how we fund schools, and that's allowed for significant entrenched resegregation of our schools, which often undermines school funding gains. There's also a level of comfort that we have accepted with racially segregated schools because we hope that school funding can overcome those challenges that those schools face. And I think treating these issues as distinct allows us to ignore the fact that in most places, educational resources, money, great teachers, rigorous coursework is plainly correlated to the whiteness and the wealth of schools. And to put it plainly, green follows white. So as Ari and I reflected, such a great audience. So as Ari and I reflected on that in our own professional context, where Ari had been a school funding person her whole life and really thought about how do we get more money and resources to schools of concentrated poverty, and I spent a lot of my career thinking, well, how do we get more of those students to have access to schools that have higher resources? We really saw the need to link the goals of reaching resource equity and school desegregation as inextricably linked. So at Brown's Promise, we're pursuing a strategy that is pursuing well-resourced and integrated schools because we think those goals acknowledge, one, that we have to actively address the state laws and policies that have created schools and districts of concentrated poverty, and then to add insult to injury, don't give them enough funding to overcome the challenges of concentrated poverty. We know racially and socioeconomically segregated schools can be successful, but it's difficult, it's expensive, it's hard to do at scale, and in majority white state legislatures, we don't get the funding that districts of concentrated poverty need to be successful. And then finally, if we have any hope of building a multiracial, 21st century, strong democracy in this country, we cannot have generations of students continuing to go to schools that are segregated and expect that they're somehow going to be prepared for the military, for higher education, and the workplace after never experiencing going to school with kids of difference.
Thank you. Absolutely.
She said green follows white.
Val's white
Matt.
supremacy headache is acting up again.
That's right. Okay, here we go. Matt, okay, I think it's fair to acknowledge communities of color who push back on integration as a tool for educational equity because past attempts have cost communities of color so much. So Samba just named that our system would be more efficient overall without these concentrations of segregation, and that there are ways to think about school funding differently that may lead to more equity. So what does it look like for a system to embrace, as integrated NYC students call, real integration?
Sure. Thank you so much, y'all. I think this, and I cringe at the green follows white, not because you said it, but because what it represents is so much an investment in white supremacy and capitalism, right? That I think is so dangerous and is like the rotten fruits of segregation is inequitably funded schools. You know, a rotten fruit of segregation is Eurocentric curriculum, right? Is school-to-prison pipeline-based discipline policies, right? And so for us in New York City, we've kind of taken that green follows white tension, and I think and leaned into it, right? And like, what does it actually mean to disrupt and dismantle that, right? And so thankfully, you know, I got to be in partnership with young people from Integrate NYC, a grassroots student-led movement in New York City, where we started to tease that question, right? Like, what does actually an integrated school mean, right? Like, a desegregated school means we all together, right? But like that, we can be together and power can still be rooted in whiteness and white supremacy, right? And for me, integration is like we have to dance and everyone gets to dance to their own tune, everyone gets to play their own song, right? That means we're sharing power, right? And so the framework, the 5 R's of real integration, thinks about race and enrollment, right? How do we assign students, right? But it also acknowledges, in New York State at least, we have this framework called the Sound Basic Education Framework, which is a school funding case, right? And I think for us, and for me, really the only way to build meaningful coalition with Black and brown families in New York City to talk about integration was to say, I'm also committed fully funded schools, right? Regardless of who's in them, they need to be fully funded. And if we're not fighting that fight, we're not doing the fight for real integration, right? And so resources is another element of that, right? But the other piece, right? Why are all the black kids sitting together, right? Like really thinking of like what's happening inside of the school, right? And so we think about relationships as another R, like what are the investments we're making in creating school cultural practices, curriculum and pedagogical opportunities for young people to connect with each other, right? Because if we're all sitting separately, we're never gonna build together, we're never gonna grow together, right? So like, again, this framework is thinking of all these different layers and all the rotten fruits of segregation, right? The fourth R is about representation. Who's at the front of the classroom? Who's leading the school? Who are young people getting to see as representatives of educational leaders, right? Educolor in the crowd, right? How are we ensuring that black and brown educators are leading our young people and like the exponential benefits that black and brown students receive from a black or brown teacher, right? So understanding that this framework requires all this work. And lastly, right, thinking about restorative practices, because the school to prison pipeline, again, is a rotten fruit of segregation, right? The first policies in New York City to exclude and remove children from schools came a year after the Brown decision was passed down. And that was because the city knew that once black and brown students and white students were together, the school needed to figure out a way to remove them, right? And so we need to understand the relationship between like disproportionate discipline policies, culturally destructive policies and practices, the inequitable funding of schools, and segregation, right? Those are all part of the practice and part of the functions of segregation. And so for us, our policy framework, our advocacy has always had to be intersectional. And this is because young people are rooted in intersectionality, and I think it means our movement as an integration movement, it ain't integration if we're not doing it all, right? And if we're not committed to doing it all, let's not do it then, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah. We're coming up on time, but I do want to give you each a chance. You know, people will point to challenges from the past ways we went about desegregation and rightfully highlight areas where they've sort of failed. But we don't have to go back to that. I think people are like, oh, so you just want to go back to busing, that didn't work, whatever. We don't need to go back to that. There are other ways to think about both of these tracks, resource equity and desegregation of schools. And just in sort of a minute each, to Sabo, you can start, like, what does that look like? What does it look like to kind of do this different for the next 70 years?
Sure. So first, I really do think it is important that we sit with and honestly confront the challenges of Integration 1.0 so that we can move differently going forward. I'm a direct beneficiary of Brown. I went to wealthy, highly resourced schools in Tampa that litigators litigated the right for me to go to. And my mother went to segregated schools in Florida. And so in one generation, we had access to opportunities in those schools that I never would have had access to. But I also faced outright racism every day of my schooling. Teachers who didn't believe in me, a sense of not belonging, feeling estranged from my own community. So I think we have to start from a place where we do not repeat any of those things going forward. And that means being serious about not viewing integration as only students of color bearing the burden of students of color leaving their schools and their communities, that's not the only way that we achieve integration. And that means we have to be creative and aggressive about different policy solutions. At Brown's Promise, we talk all the time about let's keep it real. We have to think about changing school district lines. We treat them like you cannot change them, even though we change congressional lines every 10 years. Like, they are not immovable. They are not divined by a higher power. We can change them, and we can do it in ways that do not, end public education. We can think about how to make districts more porous so students can move between them for inter-district boundary programs. We can think about strengthening magnet programs. But all of that has to be done with the student experience at the center to get to the places that you're talking about. We have diverse educators. We have a curriculum that accurately reflects culture and history. We have extracurriculars where kids can actually go to and feel that they belong in a school. So I think we start from the student experience place and then challenge some of these ideas that we think have been immovable, like school district lines.
Absolutely. Matt, bring us home.
I'll be really brief. I think there's two things that I'm really holding right now. One is you can't have integration is not just about moving bodies. It's about moving policy, resources, opportunity, and power. That's one. The second thing is for me. honestly, the two things that I'm holding right now are that we need schools that truly love our children, and like, we don't have that, right? We have schools that actually hate our children in our communities. And so if we're not investing, we're not making those commitments to love our young people, love their families, love our communities, then we will constantly be doing violence. And so like, I think that comes from, and we could talk more about this later outside, but that comes from an abolitionist like ethic, right? I think we all, in this movement and everything we're doing centered or rooted in equity, need to start thinking about how abolition fits into the practices we live in and then those that we engage in with our communities. That's all.
Let's hear it for Saba and Matt.
Yes, give it up. Let's give it up for our last panelists. And we have a place where you can come talk about it. You want to thank everyone?
Yes, so on behalf of all the panelists, on behalf of Val and myself, thank you to the Century Foundation, NCSD, AIR, the museum, the staff here. This is just an incredible event. We're really honored to be part of it.
Yeah, and thank you all for being such a dynamic audience. We really appreciate it. We cannot wait to hear this audio. And then taking Matt's final words, if we're sitting separately, we will never build together, so stay together, all right?
Thank you.
All.
I'm going to hand things back to Alejandra.
Wow. Can we get another round of applause for that incredible facilitation? Thank you so much, Val and Andrew, for that incredible facilitation and those amazing panels that you all listened to. I hope that you find the panelists that you connected with out in the program after we leave here today. It is my honor to introduce our closing speaker for the evening, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Equity and Discretionary Grants and Support Services, Dr. Bernadine Futrell.
Good afternoon. Good evening. What a wonderful way to close the evening with love. I just love those comments on that last panel. Again, I want to say thank you and welcome and just be very excited to be in this conversation with you all today. And thank you to the Bridges Collaborative as well as the Century Foundation for hosting this wonderful event and this conversation for all of us to be a part of. I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about the legacy and the heritage of Brown v. Board. I know we're here to talk about the promise and we all hold that dear in our heart, but there's a different part of the Brown conversation that I want to make sure we talk about and to help you understand the lens that we look at it through at the Department of Education. It's both a legacy that we inherit, that we get, that we're able to carry on. It's a promise, it's a hope, it's something that is to be fulfilled, it's a commitment that we have, but it's also a heritage and something that we hold, something that we have to have a responsibility for. I remember a few years ago, the first time my family and I went to the MLK Memorial here in Washington, D.C. My husband, Michael, my son and daughter, Michael and Melanie, and it was very special because we got to have a one-on-one conversation with a National Park Ranger. And the ranger talked to us about all of the different aspects of this monument, what the inscriptions meant, what even the position on the mall meant when it comes to this statue. And I always take that with me and I remember it as a reference of his ministry, his legacy, his impact. To say there's work that we've done, there's mountains we've overcome, but there's still mountains ahead. But we're not going to get caught in the despair of what we haven't been able to conquer. We're going to reflect on what we have, but we're not going to rest there. We're going to keep moving forward. And that's the work, that's the commitment that we have at the U.S. Department of Education. We have an amazing secretary in Dr. Cardona, as well as our president, that's really pushing us to think differently about how we support efforts, not only to ensure that schools are desegregated because of the legal requirements, but to ensure that every school, every community, every child has access to the highest quality, equitable education that they can. We have taken steps to ensure that we are not only administering the Magnet Schools Assistance Program, we've administered over $400 million in that program, but we also created a new program, a Fostering Diverse Schools program, to say, you know, there's efforts that districts want Thank you for that, sorry. There's efforts that districts want. They want to be able to sit and have a conversation. They want to organize to ensure that every child, regardless of zip code, that every child that they're responsible for has full access. And so that's one program that we were able to launch. But we didn't stop there because guess what? We need help. So we've established a technical assistance center. We established a technical assistant working group for fostering diverse schools. And members of a technical working group are advising and helping us understand what's happening on the ground. How can we better position the conversation around equitable funding? Because that, to me, is the legacy and the heritage of Brown, equitable funding in our schools. The Brown legacy that we hold at the U.S. Department of Education is one piece of it, but we all hold that. We don't hold it by ourselves. You hold it, I have a piece of it. I'm honored and thankful for my own personal legacy and heritage and even standing here at this and having this conversation in this auditorium and reflecting on the work and the sacrifice of my grandfathers and my family. So on both ends, my mother's dad is fighting in World War II. He's a part of the first the only integrated class of warriors at the Battle of Bulge. And then on the other end, thank you, Congressman, is my great-grandfather, Reverend Gussie Pearson. He's organizing in Clarendon County, South Carolina, to help support and institutionalize efforts to back up Levi Pearson. So both of those cases, both of those experiences is what I bring when we do this work, and I know it's what you bring when you do this work. So what I want to say on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education, one, yes, we are definitely committed to figuring out how we prioritize more funding in school, like the $122 billion that we prioritize in addition to our Title I schools through the ARP funding. But the work doesn't stop there. The work has to happen in the hearts, in the minds, and in the love of those of you in this room, those of you who work in our schools, who look in the eyes of our children, who work in our communities to keep pushing for both the legacy and the heritage. Because we, even as an agency, we only exist because of the legacy and the heritage of landmark legislation like Brown v. Board, like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, like the Civil Rights Act. That's the work that we do. And so we want to make sure that we partner together and we keep pushing so that we can be strong and confident when we demand that everybody that's working with our children in our schools are committed to raising the bar on expectations, raising the bar on access, and raising the bar on what we demand of ourselves as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Futrell, and thank you to all of our amazing speakers tonight. My name is Hallie Potter. I'm part of the Education Policy and Bridges Collaborative team at the Century Foundation, and I'm going to give you a few instructions as we close out this portion of the event. When you leave the auditorium, we invite you to go back out to our reception space where we will have lots more food and our great jazz band playing, and we want you to continue the conversation. Introduce yourself to someone new. You can use the questions that are on the tables as conversation starters, and you may have seen an activity that encourages you to interact with the text of Brown and see what you see in it. And you don't have to stay just in the reception area. We are at the amazing National Museum of African American History and Culture, and you are invited if you want to explore the galleries. There are a couple places in particular where Brown v. Board and school integration are mentioned in the galleries, and we have a map out there that's showing that downstairs in the history galleries on level C2 and upstairs on level L3 in the community galleries. And finally, a reminder, Val and Andrew mentioned this, we want to hear from you. What does Brown mean to you? What does the promise of school integration mean to you? On the reverse of your agenda, there is a QR code that will take you to a link where you can record your thoughts, your questions, your ideas for the Integrated Schools podcast. We invite you to find a quiet spot in the gallery to do that while you're here tonight, or to take some time after you go home tonight or tomorrow. So you are free to connect, to reflect, to explore, to enjoy the museum until our event ends at 10 p.m. And we hope that you will leave with ideas, questions, and commitments that you can carry forward in your organizations, in your schools, and in your communities. So thank you for being with us, and go forth.
Take me to heart, and I'll always love you. And nobody can make me do wrong. Take me for